We're delighted to have Neil Cummins here. Neil is also a visitor here for part of the academic year. He is a professor of economic history at the London School of Economics, and he was just promoted to associate professor. I assume that has something to do with your ability to spend time in Berkeley. I believe. He works on long demographic history and economic history. Last year we actually saw a co-author of his present, that was Greg Clark from Davis, on the intergenerational mobility. And today Neil is going to talk about another wonderful use of the same data in some ways, these linked surnames or not? Maybe linked surnames, but focusing on mortality of the elites. So thank you, Neil.
Okay, no, thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here. So let me kind of give a sense. So this is a separate project to the project that Greg presented. This is based on the genealogies and family trees of European aristocracy. Okay, so and this is sourced from the LDS Church. So I'll explain that. And why we see two titles here is that kind of the first kind of mortality paper really wrote itself very quickly. It was an incredible data set that just spoke to me, and and so when I'm trying to push it forward, so I'm looking at some of the marriage patterns. So I've been here, I don't know if I've met some of you, and I've noticed that these presentations generally tend to, in general, for better or worse, focus on one paper, but then discuss like wider aspects of different projects. So that's what I'll do here. There's stuff in here that's well thought out, considered, and it's pretty tight. And then there's stuff that's really seriously half baked. So you're going to get a wide selection of stuff to sample. I've got a ton of stuff I want to show you. I am not going to get through it all, so I might skip things or spend longer on certain things than others, but I'm very kind of keen for your feedback. But before we get going, it turns out I've always been kind of curious about European elites for different reasons. Like coming up in my training as an economic historian and looking at demographic history, they're always in the background, right, in terms of their patterns. So to kind of give you a sense of some of the big long-run patterns that motivate some of this, I'll just kind of skip over these things. So what you see in terms of the elites, the people that we can observe, you can see some dramatic behavioral changes over time. And in terms of, just the general history of the type of psychology that kind of rules these people, you're talking about the elites who are basically people who have a comparative advantage in violence, who are just the local bullies who just take stuff off other people and get their way. So they have coats of arms and all this mystique and glory, but that's all nonsense, right? They're all just violent thugs. But you do see over time the emergence of different psychologies, an emergence from the world of barbarism after the decline of Rome to concepts of chivalry, and then the idea of a gentleman, and that word eventually loses all meaning when we just consider anybody a gentleman. And then you can tie this into what you see in terms of the great holy grail of my discipline, which is explaining why we're not working in the fields right now with a mouthful of rotten teeth and dying in our 40s. So that's so there's lots of different things you can see from these patterns. This is just the emergence of modern economic growth in England. We're associated with these changes in demographic patterns. The causal links between these have always been at the center of any demographic textbook. You start off with demographic transition theory and in any teaching at demography. But I mean, whenever we look at the empirics of this, these causal links are always a little bit confused. What's interesting though at the individual level, which is what I do with Greg Clark, you see that the demography of the elites actually changes before that of the general population. So here we can see average life expectancy for Wrigley Schofield for England and Wales from Family Reconstitution linked together with modern day estimates from the Office for National Statistics. You can see that rising in maybe the mid-19th century for that data series. There's other data series. What you can see from some of my work, and I'll explain where this is coming from earlier, we'll talk through this, but this red line is what's happening for the longevity of the elites. You're seeing like a really significant uptick around about 1650 and other things happening earlier in time as well. This applies to fertility. This is fertility for England. Again, we can look at this red line, which is the index of marital fertility, dropping like a stone just in the late 19th century. If we look at the fertility of the elites, and this is from Massimo Livi-Bacci's article in the summary volume of the Princeton European Fertility Project, and the kind of thing that really got me interested in the demography of the elites is that you see something happening in the average family sizes of Europe's elite centuries before you see anything happening in the general population. So if you're looking for a detector of modern demographic behaviour, the elites seem to foreshadow the rest of the population. What's interesting here is, as a student of French demography, is that the French dukes and peers are much lower than their European colleagues, and that applies to the French peasants as well, but centuries down the line. So let me emphasize, please stop me at any time. I'm very much more interested in interactive seminar. But anyway, basically, okay, there's all this fertility stuff. I've got 88 slides. This is not mattering. This isn't mattering either. So basically, the whole point is, the thought is to kind of look at these different aspects of elite behavior and to see if we can track the emergence or explain why these people are perhaps living longer or having smaller family sizes for the rest of the population. Because as a detector of changing human behavior over time, these guys have left behind traces, okay? The rest of the population have not really left behind many traces, in particular before the mid-16th century and the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, when we start taking registers. Before that, it's just a dark age of demographic data, but you can actually observe this stuff and you can actually look at this. Now, one critique of this is that you're the drunk looking for the keys underneath the lamplight, and so someone asked me, why are you doing this? I said, well, that's where the light is, and that's apparently the drunk's answer. But if you're going to speculate about what's in the dark, you may as well look at what's in the light first, right? At least if we don't even know what's in the light. So I was obviously fairly bitter about that comment, so just deal with that. So I've got all these tons of things. These are just, I'm not going to talk through these things. I'm just going to jump right into it. So I had these thoughts for a long time, but I waited until I saw the right kind of data emerge that I could use. But what I've been doing a lot in my work with Greg Clark and others, Morgan Kelly and Cormac O'Grota, my compatriots at UCD, is by really exploiting the large-scale digitization of historical, demographic and genealogical data that sites like Ancestry.com have been using. But the real origin of this is actually the LDS Church. And they, for a long time, have really been the pioneers of the digitization of family-level information. All of this has been pioneered by them. Ancestry.com is connected to these guys. They're headquartered in Salt Lake City. And they've been collecting this for over 100 years and digitizing. They're the first people to really start digitizing it. So I've been using this. I mean, FamilySearch.org I think 60 billion records. There's a lot of duplicates in there, but it gives you a sense of the scale of what they've done. And what's interesting about this is that each individual observation is tractable to its original printed source, and that was what I was looking for. I couldn't do anything in economic history unless you can actually say where this is coming from, unless it's not just made up by someone typing into a computer. So everything's tractable. So what was interesting is that I collected this data set from this project. It was kind of a pioneer project of the LDS Church. I've been told they've taken the website away, so I hope they'll put it back up. But basically, it's basically digitized about over 3,000 different books of family trees for elite European families, and really they go back a long time, right? There's no descent from antiquity here. That's something that genealogists can't do. But really, they go back to around about the fall of Rome, okay, and around 600, 700. The data gets good enough for analysis around about the 9th century. And these people are not just the kings and queens and ruling families of Europe. They're the obscure middling nobility who have left a trace, but we really never kind of collect them before. So I've always kind of what a fun thing to do is just to open it up in Access and just to flick through who these people are, and then to just kind of Google them or whatever, and you get these incredible stories that are just like stub articles on Wikipedia or something like this. But so I went for a walk. This is Temple Church near London, which is this kind of weird church in what is now a legal district, but it was connected to the Knights Templar, and you find this guy Geoffrey de Mandeville. He died in 1246 at 42, and he's got this very impressive resting place, and there's a whole bunch of these different people, but he's in the data, and he's kind of quite representative. So this guy was just a wandering bandit, basically, right? He was the first earl, so this is some title, and he kind of fell out with the king, and he died in a skirmish, okay, from some sort of arrow wound. So that's going to be important because these guys generally tend to die violently, and I've got a way of protecting that. But it's these kind of middling that barely make it into an historian's footnote that are really occupying the 1.5 million observations that are in this data. So the data is kind of fascinating, but there's just like, it's just racked with just like crazy kind of problems. So here we go from, you have to kind of join me here, and what we have to do as economic historians is we deal with dirty data. We get our hands really dirty, and you've just got to go into it with your eyes open. There's going to be so many problems, and here I detail a lot of them. I think the biggest thing for the demographic analysis is that what you get is the selectivity of who gets into a family tree. If a child dies in the first few months, it generally just gets forgotten about. Okay, later on, around 1500s, 1600s, you start to see the kind of reporting of infant child deaths in these family trees that you would expect given what our understanding is of mortality rates. Before that, you don't get that. And then they're leaving out women, and there's going to be, this kind of notion of successful sons and daughters making it in, less successful don't. And you've got to understand that a lot of it is messy. As you go back further in time, you're not getting someone died on the 6th of March or whatever. You're getting someone died on, not the Ides of March, but like all these kind of Anglo-Norman phrases for the certain times of the year. So there had to be a huge project to convert dirty string dates, okay, the word dirty is going to be used a lot, into approximations of the exact time of death, right? But in many cases you do observe the exact time of death because it's a famous battle, and in many times you don't. But I'll explain what I do with that. So basically I have all these arguments. Basically I censor the data on age of death over 20. You can directly observe the changing composition of the sample. You know whether someone is a king, is an emperor, is an archduke or a duke. So you can actually see that to get into the sample in 800, you've got to be super elite. Where, in 1500, all these non-titled noble cousins are getting in who aren't as elite. So as long as you can observe all this, and there's tons of tables and data. These are the sources, but to kind of just jump into more on the data, I've got a few descriptors here. Here is a way of classifying the type of data that we've got here. So we've got births and deaths, right? So it turns out that for the high nobility, births, deaths and marriages are often affairs of state. And for those guys, they generally tend to be recorded with good fidelity. Apart, it seems, from just this is the raw sample, births, which tend to be clumped around the year 0, more and more further in the past. But you can see all these other things tend not to have this type of clumping. So this is just the proportion of all years that end in 0 or 5. Okay, so if it's just going to happen, evenly throughout a decade, which is exactly what you'd expect to happen. You expect this number to be around about 10%, which it gets to in the end, but you can see that there is this generally tendency to, not too worryingly a fashion here, because if it's symmetrical around the 0 and 5, you're just introducing this error that will wash out, but this is an issue. And so, but I'm able to also, because it's directly observed, you can somewhat control for that, and also take those guys out. So all of the thing that I show you here is aware of that. I spent a lot of time looking at the data. You worry that some averages are just blankly applied, so you just look at the distributions of age at death. These are smoother curves, that's why it goes, that's just to make it look nice. You know, there's no one below 20 in this sample. And then you do observe people dying above 123, but you know, that's just, so they're just taken out based on the Jean-Claude.
This is your raw data, or this is
this is raw data. So like this is just like a sanity check. That's what I'm showing to you now. And then you see this distribution shift over time. Maybe the 8th century, which I don't use, seems to have some sort of just attribution. So it's just a way of understanding where the data is coming from. So I spent a lot of time in the actual paper. This is part of the analysis, but I'm going to skip it here. And just as a kind of sanity check on the data, we can take the well-known years of the epidemics of bubonic plague, right? So basically you have plague returning to Europe around 1346, and it's interesting to see if this data, right, it can actually act as a detector for those outbreaks. Just in these terms, and what you see is it absolutely does every single year here in terms of this moving average index of relative mortality, where 1 would equal the average level of mortality 5 years before and 5 years after. It's you know, that's going to be affected by this plague era, but you can see that there's particularly unusually severe outbreaks in all these years, and then you can see it pretty much disappears. Plague leaves Europe around 1720 in Marseille, but it don't really seem to have many of my elites living there. So I think this must be the 1665 plague in London. So that works well. And the nice thing about it is that you get all this individual level data. You can see what type of people are dying. So I have this kind of dispute with people now over what the sex impact is of plague, because I'm seeing quite an interesting female effect. But that's like, I mean, I've gotten a lot of blowback over that. Like, but it's kind of like something that emerged as a kind of an artifact of my main analysis. But it is interesting because if there are kind of sex differential impacts of these massive kind of plagues, it can have different effects on relative wages and also things like the early marriage patterns. It was one of the speculative things in the paper that I got a lot of use for. But anyway, the other side of plague is that this is all just, I'm showing this to you to kind of give you a sense of the data and whether it makes sense. One thing that's really interesting about the plague era, it meant that most people during this period would die during this plague season, which was, you know, really late summer. It'd typically be a very hot summer during a plague epidemic. Deaths would start to tick up around, you know, mid to late August and peak in September. And when you see in say this is from another paper on London burials, you can see this. You can just see this kind of seasonal pattern just completely reverse as plague disappears. But also you see the seasonal pattern, pretty much exactly the same thing, kind of in this aristocratic family tree. So you can see here this black line is the relative deaths by month of death in the 1300s, when plague returns to Europe. And you can see it's kind of elevated summer deaths for the plague period, and then you kind of get down to normal kind of peak mortality during winter and somewhat of a low during the summer. So again, that was something that was kind of interesting, but not really the main kind of takeaway. And what the kind of paper focused upon, the first one, was looking at this lifespan data, but also trying to ascribe trends over time and space. But to do this, we had to control for the changing selectivity of the sample. But the nice thing about what the LDS Church had done in this particular data set was the GEDCOM format that they use for, that they actually invented for linking pedigree and family tree data, has all these entry fields for kind of titles and also all the different familial links. All these guys are linked to each other. And I'm actually going to show you some uses of that, which actually echo some of the work I've done with Greg Clark as well. But anyway, these are the nobles. I'll take the question, yeah.
Is there I don't think that the nobility rank was constant over this entire 1,000-year period, right? So you have to take that into consideration.
Well, first of all, you're absolutely right, and some of these titles are invented during the period of sample, and also the other thing is they don't mean the same thing in different countries.
Right.
So no, I didn't. I'm aware of that, but I haven't actually fully kind of taken. So it's something to kind of think. I mean, I think maybe you could just come up with more categories. Like you could be a duke in the 13th century and dummy that out. So right now it's a simple kind of thing, I guess. And then the other thing is you could have other things where you're a duke in the 13th century in England versus a duke in the 13th century in Germany. So I think the data is big enough to get that. It's just expandable. But I think you're right. But I haven't actually done that yet. But it's kind of interesting to kind of see who's in here. There's popes in here. There's I forget how many. But it's also interesting to see the different religious titles come in. But it also can kind of serve as a different kind of sanity check on the data. But you can see that what's really blowing up the numbers. And so, like I've gotten this paper's been around a while, so I've gotten the feedback. So one of the criticisms that you should be making is that basically not only does the composition change over time, it's really, when I say 1. This big number, first of all, I only observe around 120,000 who actually have the age of death. A lot of them are just fragments that come in as, someone's cousin is in the family tree data, but you don't observe anything about them. So that's blowing up the numbers. But a lot of these numbers are coming from the heraldic surveys that were conducted in the 15th and 16th centuries in England to establish nobility and citizenship rights in these cities and so forth. So that's blowing up the numbers somewhat. So the numbers are maybe a little bit overstated. But the latest version of the paper...
Can you say a little bit more about the religious titles? Or what about cardinals and abbots?
Yeah, they're in there. So that's all.
Those records should be pretty accurate.
Yeah. And so so some of the comparator studies are for these monastic communities as well. So they're the only people who have estimates of how long anybody was living in the 12th century in England. So my patterns are slightly different to those. Yeah, but monastic. So there's also, I mean, a common kind of strategy for elite families would have like a favourite son who would be maybe expected to take over the father's title, and then maybe send someone off to a monastery or something who could be called upon if the son dies. So you'd have an heir and a spare and all these kind of things. So those monastic communities are often elite safety deposit boxes. Yeah. So here's some of the data. And so the data again is so super rich. So you've got these GED conformants that not only is recorded like where someone is from, it typically is recorded where they're born, where they're married, and where they died. So you for like at best you'll observe people moving around, right? So there are kind of papers now in economics and economic history that look at these kind of movements of people to look at the trends over time. But basically, it's just this is just kind of I don't know what this is. So it's not a heat map. It's basically because I did it manually. It's just basically different colors for these kind of different kind of observations. You get good numbers for most of Europe, with the caveat that it's heavily biased towards like England, Wales, and those heraldic surveys. But I'll show you some heat maps later on, which are able to kind of maybe condense some of this information into different patterns. So this is one of the results that's I think the most interesting. I mentioned that these guys basically got their position not like basically through their ability to execute violence better than other people, right? So my initial thought on this was that you could just get all these guys' deaths and link them to known battles, right? But it turned out when I started looking at the data was quite large. I observed that like for those who get a reported exact death date, this is not unfair, that would be ridiculous, right? For those who have an exact death date, looking at that subsample, which is about 76,000 over the 1,000-year period, you can observe different types of clumping in that data, right? So if you think about what the probability is that someone will share a death day, okay, given, say, a random distribution of deaths in a year. We know it's not random, but it's everybody's not typically dying on one day. We'll talk about plague later, right? But basically, by generalizing the famous problem in statistics, this birthday, for the birthday probability, the idea like this room probably, we could go around and we'd find that maybe we have a shared birthday. it's possible that we don't, but if we added 20 more people, we'd have an 80% chance that we'd have a shared birthday. And that kind of intuition is kind of alien, I think, to the way we natural selection has taught us to think. Even we can show the maths and we can prove it, but I mean, none of us there's very few people who have the intuition for that. But if you apply that to the death dates and you kind of construct what is the probability of a shared death day given these assumptions, you can kind of look at those observed clumps and assign whether they are in fact battles or deaths or a clumping of people all dying on the same day. So here's just like here's the idea. So if you have, say, in my data in 1513, there's 150 people die in 1513 in my data. They all have exact death dates throughout the year. And then 88 of them are dying on, which is, well, 9th September, which also happens to be my birthday, but basically, not 1513, but basically, 88 people dying in 9th September 1513, out of 148 people dying in the year. Something happened on the 9th of September 1513, right? Something bad happened, right? And what you get, of course, all of these things, when you look at these different combinations, these inflection points in the data, they all correspond to well-known battles as well. So basically, that's the idea. But I talked about this first Earl of Essex, Geoffrey of Mandeville. Now, he died in the 13th century in a skirmish, right? And so it turns out that this type of family tree data for the middling, forgotten, footnote at best nobles, the actual data itself is the best remnant of their deaths. Minor skirmishes, it could have been recorded that him and a bunch of his friends who are in the data all die in that day. Okay, so what you want to do is apply some sort of algorithm that looks at all of these combinations and assigns whether they are likely some sort of violent event. Okay, so here you have, they all get assigned by the algorithm, but it's quite actually, so like I was able to kind of like, this is kind of like what you have, these are the observable ranges in the data. So you have 0 to 2,000 people dying in a given year, and then you can see here the probability of m people sharing a birthday, where m equals 2. Okay, so like basically you can see that these things kind of shift out, and you can just write a simple code that assigns for all those combinations whether a death day is violent, and then all those individual level observations get coded as either dying violently or not. And then you can start to have fun, really, because here are the simple averages, being super conservative about duplicates. There were certainly duplicates for the high-end nobles between these different trees. You know, like for instance, later on, Queen Victoria is going to be in about 5 different ones. So you've got to be very careful of this. But basically, this is just the raw average. We worry about changing selectivity, so I can kind of, you know, just factor out all of these different things. Looking at the effect of being a female is somewhat of a sanity check, and I also estimate the probabilities, and they're all very low. I'll talk about that in a moment. But this is the kind of time trend that you get for the data. And what's interesting is this is kind of like just estimating for the men in the sample, what the proportion is going to be of men dying from the regression in the last page, which follows the raw data is pretty much verified. And you see this decline, quite sudden decline around 1500, and you can see here this corresponds very closely to Hollingsworth's study of about the English ducal families, the title which is just established in this period. So it tracks that quite well, but it's also quite interesting because it's kind of, you know, it just shows this behaviour change. So you're not only seeing later on that they're living longer, okay, and we can talk about the connection with this, with lifespan later, but basically you're seeing the family sizes change. So this is also foreshadowing some of the changes that we see at the lower levels, or not the lower levels, the peasant levels of human society, for want of a better word, and like explaining this, okay, this pattern is also something very interesting. And I must say, because looking for things to compare this with, even though we have a famous kind of work on the decline of violence, and we had a presentation a few weeks ago where I was asked some questions about the guy on this, we have very few actual time series that show like this pattern. over time. So I think this is interesting. So that's just kind of reported here, and let me show you some of the kind of new stuff that I've done. So with Greg Clark, a lot of the stuff that we do is looking at the connectivity of status across generations, right, and seeing what that correlation looks like. Here you can actually look, because this method assigns violence at the individual level, you can actually see to what extent is the propensity to die violently inherited, right? So you can actually construct a beta, and you can see if this beta is changing over time. Because I know, like, some people might suspect that dying violence is a behavioral characteristic that could well be composed of genetic parts, right, and environmental parts. So you can see, you can actually have a little test for this. So basically, here is some of the results between father and son, okay? And you can see here, this is it overall for the sample. You're getting a correlation of 0.23, which is pretty much what modern studies find for the correlation of, say, smoking, right? So there's these kind of things. Disregard this. This is not helpful on 42 different observations. But what's interesting about this is that you see this kind of more or less kind of 0.15, 0.2 correlation in the 1500s and 1600s, but just where it declines, the correlation kind of breaks down. So one thing that kind of you could possibly think about this meaning is that decline in violence is not an issue of all the violent people are just being purged from the population over time. It's more that, like, there are people who should be dying violently in this period but who aren't, right? So that correlation breaks down. Yes.
Have you looked into whether it's all just geography and nothing to do with this sort of father-son transmission?
No, that's a good question. So the composition geographically changes over time. So what I've done is so I put, oh God, where is it?
Because it could just be that after 1500 or whatever, whereas before there were violent regions and peaceful regions, every region was peaceful afterwards.
Yeah. So like I've got some controls for latitude and longitude, but what I did was basically I wanted to see what this looked like over space. And I just did it for all time, and it just looks like a bit of a mess. But let me just say, I think you're right. And so here's what I'm thinking with this. It turns out that there's different... So one of the big theories about the decline of violence is the role of the state and the civilizing process and... what's this guy's name? Anyway, I forget the guy's name. It'll come back to me later. But what I'm talking is you'll see regional variation in this. And then you can actually see if the state is... Like, if these kind of laws that ban these things can explain some of this. So... The answer to your specific question is it could be that. I've had a look at it, but I haven't robustly chased it down yet. But I mean, I suspect that there's mileage to be got from looking at that angle, and it's something I intend to do.
You also think about changes in technology, how you could die, what kinds of weapons were available.
Yeah.
Which also might make the laws endogenous to the system of violence.
Yeah. So like warfare is changing over this period, and it's quite striking that that like you have different periods when chivalry is dominant, and then there's different innovations. And what's really happening towards the end of the period, and in this kind of time trend, is that you have the famous like rise of modern warfare, right? So basically, Richard III was the last English king to die in battle, and he was recently found underneath a car park in Leicester, and then they gave him a state funeral. But he led from the front, right? And that was what a person like that did. Once you get to this later period, nobles are still heavily overrepresented in military operations, in particular the wars of the religion are really, nobles play a large role, but it's just not to the same extent as it was before. So you can look, by the time you get to the early 20th century, you've got a complete professionalization of the war. So like basically, one small point on that is that Winston Churchill was a noble. Like he was connected to the Duke of Marlborough. He was actually offered to be the Duke of London after the war, and he refused because he realised their aristocratic heyday was over quite astutely. But he was like, he kind of very much is seen as being strategically important for that war effort, but he wasn't like leading from the front line. Technology, professionalization had taken over. So that's a big part of this. But I mean, the exact timing of this it just seems to be quite strange, and it's a mystery to see it. Now that kink that's looking quite structural. You'd worry about compositional change of the sample driving that. So there's a few things to think about, but the kink itself. I mean, the trend is undoubtedly downwards, whereas before it's more or less flat. And you could look at it for different types of ovals.
So that's right when Henry VIII started the Church of England, right? So should we be worried that there would be a fundamental change in the way that churches are sort of recording vital events?
Sure. So when you get 1538, you can kind of like a lot of this. Yeah, you get in the church records, but it's interesting. Like these are independent from those church records. Like they're not being sourced from the church records at any point in time. Like that doesn't make it into the sources. So it's not a change that you move to those sources. The sources are these books of family trees.
So the confidence intervals decline dramatically at the same point, which means the number of observations is increasing dramatically. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So there is a compositional change, right? Because which people you've got, unless there's an explosive growth in aristocracies across Europe, most of you are England and France.
Yeah. Sure. So like that's something that I was saying. Like you could basically, I think you could estimate this for those noble categories individually. Because if you're concerned, I think if I read your concern as being that maybe these heraldic surveys are coming in, and that's something that I worry about as well. But they're coming in at this period.
Okay.
Yeah. So I control for the regressions, but I mean I agree with your concerns. There's more that can be done on this, and I can kind of look at that, and it might have more interesting.
We have about 15 minutes, so if you're.
Oh no, it's fine. Look, I mean, I've still got about 65, but I don't really. If they're interested, I'd much rather present stuff that people are interested in.
Yeah, because I have a completely tangential question.
Yeah, we'll just go for it.
I was wondering, have you done something like this, looking at like disease-related deaths, like deaths? So I mean, the nice thing about this battle is that presumably it's one date, everyone who dies from that battle. Maybe even if they die the next day from their wounds, they're probably given that day at the battle.
Yeah.
For a disease, a plague wave, it might come over the course of the month, right? But you may still be able to identify that in the data as a month in which people maybe were more likely to die.
Oh yeah, so in this paper I have a whole section on the plague stuff, but like that. So like the reason why I don't present it is kind of in subsequent revisions of the paper, I just use it as a kind of a data check. Because I mean I think the particular referees at this point had a real idea in their bonnet and the sex effect of the plague.
Known, but actually not much of this. There's a lot known about the health and.
Oh no, but so I'll give you some of the conclusions from this. So like there's a whole section on plague, and you worry about plague and this, because you think they're going to confound each other. But like I mean, for various different reasons, like the decline of violence, you'd expect like this is declining in the plague era when the heraldic surveys of various different cities should be blowing this up. So I mean, either the trend is downward, it might even be more downward.
Well, just sort of just the comment, we said you only do this when it's like one exact day, right?
Yeah.
You don't use this exact days.
Sure. So some nice stuff in the plague. Plague mortality seems to be relatively lighter amongst the elite. It's like 2 or 3 times average mortality, whereas it's actually much more like 20 times average mortality in other studies, one of which is mine on London. And you've got things, the sex thing I thought was really interesting because I also have on my laptop like 10 million records from plague era London. And they're all individual records and I've never used them. We just averaged them by week and did this kind of geospatial epidemiological analysis. And then, because my co-authors kind of decided to go and do other things, and so did I, we just left it, but I've still got the data. So I put the same model that I put on this on that data, and you're still getting these female sex effects, And then there's all these things where are women more likely to care for the dying and the dead, and all these different things. Then you see this age effects as well. So I don't know. Maybe I just shied away because I got this abuse. But I mean, yeah, there's definitely stuff there in the paper. I'm going to play on if it's okay. So basically, that was fairly interesting. This is another kind of test on the penalty for having a violent death. So if your father dies violently, and you have a connectivity with his status, okay, which is higher than the propensity of violence, so that correlates with generate. What's the penalty of your father dying in terms of your noble rank, in terms of that scheme, if we just take that linearly in a really ugly way? That seems to decline over time, which is kind of weird, because you would expect that if there's a rational interpretation for why violence is declining, it should be related to the cost of violence increasing. It's more costly to have a duel because you get in trouble and you lose your status. So this is just making the problem kind of worse. But that's preliminary work, and I'm going to move on really quickly because there's so many problems with that. But anyway, so the whole kind of set of analysis in this paper would involve chucking a whole load of different types of linear OLS style models, probits for different types of data, and then also some machine learning techniques just to kind of get at the complete, non-linearity of the data. All these different techniques show the same pattern over time. So controlling for everything, there could be more nuanced controls that came up earlier. So again, before we see the time trend, here are the nodal rank effects. Again, this is just a simple effect for 1,000 years. So again, you can see kings and emperors generally tend to die younger. They tend to be like the target effect, right? And you can see military, it's significantly lower than the average. The coefficient on age of death, but with a large time error, which is kind of what you'd expect. But in average, there seems to be a bonus to having some sort of title, which is kind of what we get from any kind of study of any human population. Status seems to be correlated with longer life.
Where's the bonus?
So this is
Compared to
zero, right?
What's zero?
Zero is where you have no title.
It's your 1 million people.
Yeah, exactly. And then if you have a title like Duke, you live, I think Duke is quite high, it's 4, so you get this modest bonus.
And so no title suggests that those people are of lower status than the people who actually have a title listed.
Yeah.
They're less important in the familial networks. Just making sure.
And what is the scale?
The scale
Which is higher,
the
the noble rank.
Oh no. So this is another problem. So like one is emperor, that's a king. Okay. Then you got the princes.
Just in general. So it goes down.
And then like 16 is like these things which are just. There's the 14 is military. Yeah. Then
so you want to just have a drop of nobility in you.
yeah. But you're connected somehow. You're an untitled cousin, and someone's been managed to find some record that you connect in. Yeah, you're right there.
So tell me about the length of life and your likelihood of making it into this data set. So you think after 20 everybody has an equal chance, or do you think that the longer you live, the higher the chance you have of getting in, unless you're a king, when you get in no matter what?
Yeah, so like, I mean, you gotta, I guess that's something that could be thought about a little bit more. I think my sense is that people, apart from before around 1500, when infants are just not considered worthy of being written in, and particularly like dead infants, and it seems to me people were pretty sure to kind of like fill in who the legitimate connectors were. And so that would be the motivation. So if someone's 20 or they're 50, it's not, I think like after 20, that the idea of a living heir. I would actually push it further, because you see rulers that are significantly younger than 20 in European history, and but of course they rule because of the blood connection. It's not their ability, it's the blood, and maybe they'll have people who can help them rule, but it's very important for most European history that there's a legitimate claim to throne. Most of European history is family feud over the claims of legitimacy. English history is brothers and cousins, disputing different things. So these things matter, and they're important. So I think after that age, the probability of getting in is pretty much flat. And so here's the main kind of takeaway from this paper. So when I first did this, you'll notice the lack of confidence intervals. So like the reason was because when the first working version of the paper, I calculated confidence intervals, and I still do in one of the graphs, based on year or decade, and so they were super wide. So when you do like 20 years or 50 years even, you get very tight confidence intervals. So like these patterns can be shown to kind of be different, at least between the different half centuries and centuries. So I showed this one, just taking out the confidence intervals, because it just connects it back to this violence. You could think, are these trends, what's violence contributing to this? So like basically, if you take this red line, this is kind of my estimate for what this sample's longevity is. There's some striking things. You seem to see this kind of decline around about 1200, and then just seemed to be a slow rise up until around 1500, and then this kind of big kick up before it kind of falls away again just towards the end of the period. So they're the kind of the two big movements. And I guess like the issue was what was going on here. This is where the violence is declining, but violence is, there's a lot happening here in terms of urbanization and disease, climate and plague. So violence just seems to be, the decline of violence just stops, seems to be a downward trend in noble health at this time. So violence and the time trend in health seem to be loosely connected. Violence is not explaining these swings. So the mysterious swings are the one that happens really around here when it starts to tick up, and then 1650. Now there is other work on other samples that are showing this 1650 tick up. Alison Weir's genealogy of the English royals has been analysed by Paul David and Johansson, and that they see that kind of same pattern. David Delacroix has a paper on an index of notables from Hammurabi to Einstein. So that paper, amazingly enough, when I saw that, I was like, oh, well, it's over. go find something else to do. But like they find that 1650 tick, but before 1400, their data just isn't thick enough to do anything. So it left a huge amount of stuff to fill in as well. So like I think the stability is quite interesting, and dip and then a certain rise. And this kind of like this recovery of noble longevity is a little bit mysterious. One thing that could be done is to look at the spatial variation, and I'm going to just push forward and just show you the spatial variation. Okay, so this hasn't come out quite well, but here's a heat map of what's going on in terms of median age at death for the sample as a whole. And what you see is that there's a strong northwest-southeast gradient. I don't know if the colours are coming out, but it looks nice on this screen. But it's trust me, it's there to kind of like just bring this out. You see this kind of pattern in terms of the scale of this with bands. You can see there's going to be different things happening for where London and Paris are. They're going to have the big hits, but generally you're seeing as you go from south to north and west to east, kind of quite an interesting kind of pattern that just kind of blows up like crazy there, but it's in the kind of controlled effects. If we split this by sub-period, you can see that this pattern, we don't really have enough to really be precise about it in the pre-1000 era, but by the time we get to 1340, you can see this in the data. And then it's just there consistently throughout the period, although the longitude effect washes out post-1700. But what's interesting about this is that in terms of the rise of Northwest Europe from the southeast, we have very little indicators of why on earth the barbarians of the north were suddenly developed faster than the barbarians of the south, right? So like it's an interesting correlation. Again, in the working paper, my suggestions on this like did go to, like, everybody believes it. Well, not everybody believes it, but like people accept it. But like my speculations on it went down like a ton of bricks, right? So that's something that could represent future research. And again, you could use the spatial variation to test hypothesis soundly. But I think the pattern is interesting, unexpected, and unknown, and exists before the Black Death. I've done robustness checks on this as well that I'm happy to talk about. You can see here the effect of this violence dummy. Okay, the algorithm is assigning this, and this is kind of coming in terms of years that you're taking off someone's life, and in a kind of an expected way. This is the effect of being illegitimate, which is kind of has these effects early on as well, which are also interesting and are more of a future research. So like the whole thing, I was going to go on marriage, but the marriage stuff is super interesting. I think that's all I can say, right? As I don't have that much time. But the point is that the data is, each observation is linked to another observation, the way we're linked to our fathers, to our children, to our spouses. So the dynamics of that are just great. The one thing I'll squeeze in, so I've got all this stuff on marriage, which we'll skip over. There's a map of the marriage pattern. The French seem to be married young for some reason. But basically, what's interesting in terms of the health effects is that we know the extent to which these guys are inbreeding. The way they're marrying their own cousins. They don't marry their siblings. That does not happen. That's an ancient world phenomenon. That's Cleopatra. That's what those guys are doing. But what's interesting is that if you calculate this coefficient of inbreeding, which you need to take from the family tree to get this F coefficient, you can slot that into this, the age-at-death regressions to see what the effect is, right? So you can actually detect inbreeding depression in these European elite lineages. I know why this might be wrong, but I'll see if you can see another problem with it as well. Yeah, just because it's quite compelling. This is like, this guy was the most inbred guy in the sample, and this is kind of Drogo Nestle, and he was some character. Like, he was responsible for the first. They got the first Holocaust during the First Crusade. He really liked slaughtering Jewish people. Anyway, so he's an inbred nasty person. Okay, so like I didn't get through everything, but I hope I gave you a flavour of the project, and I very much appreciate your comments, and particularly this is an audience that maybe hasn't seen this kind of thing before. Okay, thanks.
You want to call on people? Or?
Oh yeah, go ahead.
So it was a fascinating talk. You're doing marvels with this data source. I had the fun of working with it in very early days in part of the Focal project when early family history books were used. From that experience, I would urge you to incorporate more global variables about the character of the family history that from which the data are sourced. Because I think there'll at least be part of your audience that will have the skepticism that Josh expressed about the relationship between length of life and getting into the history in these little gentry areas. Is in order, most of these histories are compiled by people. And they're compiled often by descendants. And so the lines, typically, at least in the ones that we work with, you have a primary line that gets down to some modern descendants, and then as many of the offshoots as you can get along the way, often if they're American publication, going only from the immigrant ancestor and then back to the European line, just what can be gotten from the much more public record.
Yeah.
The result of this is that those most lines, as we know, branching process theory, most lines die out of all these families. And so you're looking at the lines, you're ultimately conditioning on the lines that didn't die out. Now, the degree to which survival back at these early periods is strongly correlated with the branching process success, it's not clear, but you have the information sort of in your sources of where those family histories are rooted. And so there's quite a bit, I think, that can be done to look at whether conditioning on the survival lines is really pulling up some of those positives in the lower ranks that you're seeing. You may well be right, but you're going to face a skeptical audience around that. And having some ammunition to counter the objection that Josh brings up, I think would strengthen the consent that you.
No, I completely accept that. So, I mean, I think it's got a greater precision on a different type. So, like, I mean, I think if you have a book that's written in 1650, right, and it's adding all these people in, you just have this, the bottom ends of the branch, and then as you go back and forth, like each generation you go back, you're only really linking in, a certain kind of one and a branch of like multiple branches that end. So one thing that I was curious about that was to just actually inspect. You can visualize these structures, and you can look at these branches ending. And so it's a lot of fun, as you can use products like Gephi to do that. But what I need to think about techniques for actually getting at that. The first thing I would do is actually probably start to visualize the data and think about how we could do that, because you will observe some lines ending, right, I guess, and you can actually, so like, I don't know, the concept of filling in, I mean, these are things that I'm just thinking about, but I mean, I think I could do that, yeah. I'm perfect. I have to think about how I would get at it. It's going to be a job to do. I think.
Well,
yeah.
Doing it on the micro level
Yeah.
is very difficult.
Yeah.
The family histories are categorized in different types already.
Yeah.
And so you can, and so some of them follow more branches
Yeah.
and others, so some of them are predicated back from descent lines of survivors. Some of them are attempting to follow all lines forward from 1650 or 1450 or something. That's probably,
Is your suggestion simply,
and it could be mined for 4 categories or 5 categories, and you see if you get any differences.
No, sure.
Just across the categories.
Sure.
So I'll ask a question after Delacroix was here, and he was working with, I guess, these books of famous people. So I think Carl Mason and I, we looked at Wikipedia and said, what, do we really have to transcribe books? Aren't all the famous people in Wikipedia? And so now I'm kind of thinking about your project compared to that. It seems like the big advantage is that you have linked people.
Yeah.
I mean, both of these types of ways of doing business, horrible problems which we don't know what process brought you into the
Sure.
assembly. But you have these linked people, and that's what seems to me
Yeah.
to be the comparative advantage of the project. I was wondering if you could talk about a couple of more things that you, besides doing father and son, are there other ways that the linked people are helping you?
Well, I mean, like just like the first thing is, one thing I've been working with again is the inheritance of age at death, which is actually the lowest coefficient of anything. You inherit status at a far greater fidelity than age at death. There's a huge random component, but you can actually just like look at that and going back to lots of different generations. But then you'd be concerned about who's not getting into the sample and so forth. But you can at least observe like father and child. It was almost the links that were focusing on the marriage part of the analysis. So I'll give you the intuition of what's happening there. You'll see marriages, right, and you'll see different families connecting over space. So you're seeing like blood connections, but also matrimonial connections. So one of the marriage paper has this idea of looking at these dynastic connections at all from high dynastic to middling to lower dynastic levels, and looking at the impact of that on European conflict over the past 1,000 years. And what you see is like weird effects, because one of the things about dynastic marriages is because of this intergenerational transfer of tendencies and behaviours and violence and the nation ability in the early period, is you have dynastic marriage to end a war, but that just creates more claimants on a throne in the next generation. So you're seeing these mixed kind of, you're actually seeing controlling for distance, that dynastic marriage actually increases the probability of war in the next generation, whereas marriage in the lower ranks of nobility is decreasing that. So that's one example of the kind of thing you can do with that. I think the inbreeding depression stuff is also kind of interesting. So like, I mean, you can also observe, there was different kind of social dynamic things you can do as well in terms of connectivity and the hazards of fertility. Fertility is another thing that I was looking at, which actually follows on to some of these branching episodes. And the fertility is really interesting because a really high proportion of the members, particularly female members of these families, stay unmarried and childless over this period, which may be due to the fact that if you're transferring these tendencies, they've sons who say, I'm the king. So yeah, I think the project will persist as a marriage thing, and I'm hoping to do something on fertility as well, if the data makes sense and I believe it. Yeah. Conditional tests. Yes.
These aren't necessarily tendencies toward violence, it's more like this is your job.
Yeah,
I mean,
exactly.
so you're in this
Yeah.
position,
And your job
you are
changes.
taught
Yeah.
to do this, therefore
Yeah.
this is what you learn to do.
Yeah.
Right?
So that's why I would actually agree with that interpretation.
You have the state to defend, you have to.
Right.
If you-
I mean,
the
and
state
others-
gets
and your
transferred.
vassals depend on you to do this,
Right.
right? You know, these
And-
work.
And I think that would be the interpretation. It's not a deterministic tendency at all. It seems to be just at that moment in time, and that's why the correlation goes down. So that's people can change, I guess, is the take.
No, some people said their job changes.
Yeah,
The
exactly.
nature
Yeah.
of their social position changes, right? So the nature of conflict changes and the nature of who does the armed conflict changes.
And I think following on that, you're talking about the professionalization of sort of military, and I'm wondering if what you're seeing at 1500 or something is not sort of a shift necessarily in violence, but it's a shift in before being the sort of key violent person got you nobility, because that was a noble thing, and now it is not, right? So
No,
now-
I completely accept that. So to maybe rephrase it, so like it's like the nature of warfare changed. So like before 1500, if you wanted to be a ruler, you basically had to lead from the front, and that had a cost, right? But after that, it was much more actually about organization of large-scale armies, which could be done in an office and had a different set of skills. So it's, there could even be more people getting killed. It's just not your kind of role in it. Like the leader guy is more in the back room, pushing kind of models around on a map, instead of like leading from the front.
But I also wonder if that makes some sense out of your heritability coefficient falling off.
Yeah, no, exactly. Yeah, no, I think it's consistent. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, let's end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.